Nancy Douyon has a remarkable story that led her into a career in technology. From her childhood in Haiti, to moving to Boston and taking part in an MIT program as a kid, to running away from home, and then teaching as a teenager. Nancy's unconventional path gives her a unique perspective on how to approach product design for an audience that includes everyone. We chat with Nancy about her initial reluctance to enter a technical field despite her talent, how she thinks about making sure research represents a diverse set of users, and understanding global perspectives in product design. We hope you enjoy this chat with Nancy Douyon, and thanks for listening.
Support for Design Better comes from Gusto, who make running a small business easy. Get 3 months free at gusto.com/designbetter once you run your first payroll. Running a small business is hard work, especially all of the payroll, quarterly tax filing stuff, and HR things. I'd rather be focused on my business and my customers than dealing with the administrative duties. But Gusto makes it easy. They automated the complicated parts of running a business. With Gusto, I never miss federal or state payroll tax filings, and I love the time off requests and time tracking tools. Gusto even offers a small group health insurance option for nearly any budget. When you run into issues you need help with, their HR experts are ready to help. It's a very well-designed product, easy to use, and great emotional design that will put a smile on your face. Design Better listeners get 3 months free once they run their first payroll. Just go to gusto.com/designbetter. That's gusto.com/designbetter. I've worked with lots of search firms, both as a leader searching for new talent for my teams, and as an individual exploring new steps in my career. But I trust none more than Wirt & Company. Since 1995, Wirt & Company has been the design community's most trusted search firm, co-founded by a designer and led by a CEO who has in-house operational startup experience. Wirt & Company is guided by the principle that creative leadership is essential to business success. They've helped some of the most admired brands from early-stage startup to Fortune 500 build world-class creative teams. We're talking about companies like Airbnb, the New York Times, the Four Seasons, Notion, Figma, Google, Cartier, and Fair. Not bad. If you're looking for a partner to help you find the right person for a critical role, look no further than Wirt & Company. And if you're looking for your next design leadership role, Wirt & Company will guide you through the process as a friend and a champion throughout your journey. They take the time to get to know you, to understand what you need professionally and personally. Whether you're looking for your next role or your next team member, Wirt & Company can help you find a meaningful relationship. Visit wirtco.com to learn more and get in touch. That's WERTCO.com.
Before we jump into the interview today, we're going to take a few minutes to sit down with a couple of our colleagues to talk about a few articles that we've recently released on InsideDesign.com.
Joining us today, we have Allison Rand, Senior Director of Design Operations, and Mike Davidson, VP of Partnerships and Community, both at Envision.
In our conversation with Mike and Allison, we talk about the emerging discipline of ethics in design and how it's starting to play an important role in our industry. And we also talk about the crazy debacle that was the Iowa Democratic caucuses and how design and engineering played a key role in the democratic process. Mike and Allison, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
So Allison, you recently wrote this article on our Designer Confidential, How Do I Create a Healthy Team Culture When My Own Boss is Toxic? And unfortunately, I have my own toxic boss here. I was hoping he didn't have to deal with it, but we'll work with that as best we can. So what inspired you to write this article, and how did you think about the way that you wanted to structure it, which I thought was great?
I was inspired to write the article, based on the question that came in through Designer Confidential. It's the one that stood out to me because I've thought about this for a long time, certainly in all the times I've spent over my career building teams and studying team dynamics, et cetera. And it's certainly in design operations, thinking about how I could be effective and how my role in design operations is pretty connected to the support for design operations. Otherwise, I'm sort of dead in the water. So I have seen and understand how difficult it is to create healthy team dynamics in unhealthy situations, and have thought about it, what what it takes to build a healthy team, what it means to be a leader, what it means to be a leader from the top, in the middle, wherever you are trying to lead a team, and what you can do individually to kind of foster a sense of healthier dynamics or a safe environment in the best of situations and under the worst of circumstances.
How does it work when you have a toxic leader? How might we think about managing up and speaking to that, giving people that feedback in a way that they can hear it?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes I think people find themselves in a position where they're kind of defending the team, and I think in a lot of those situations it becomes very difficult to be a servant leader when you have to kind of quote unquote protect your team from a toxic leadership or whatever have you. But I think a lot of that connection really comes from the communication. And I'm not sure what the exact right answer is in terms of being the person who has to be on the front line between the toxic leadership and the team. But I often find that it's ways to really understand what the underlying motivations are potentially of that person who's leading in a way that might not be the healthiest for the organization or for the team. And if you can kind of extract some of those underlying motivations, then you can find the right ways, the ways in which the message can be received. And having worked in client services for so long, I was definitely in those situations often, bringing design into organizations where it was, maybe not necessarily wanted, or it was the kind of last ditch effort to save something, and trying to prove the value of the work the team is doing is really about understanding, again, the people, like your audience and the person that you're creating the work for. And so trying to work around the personality or whatever it might be that's the disconnect or the friction, and just focus on how to communicate best to those types of people and how to also teach your teams to deliver in these types of circumstances. And so much of it is around framing, I think.
I think it's also important to be careful about how we use the word toxic. Like I have heard the word toxic used to describe very minor behaviors. So, hey, my boss is toxic. He or she cuts people off. Like, no, that's not really toxicity. That's a bad habit that you probably shouldn't do in the workplace. Whereas, I've also seen toxic bosses that are truly toxic, that poison everything around them, that are really a drag on the company culture, that do things that are potentially even borderline illegal in the workplace. So we should just be careful about how we throw the word toxic around, because I think there are different resolutions for different levels of toxicity, so to speak. I think if you have a leader in the organization who is truly toxic and everybody sees it, they're probably not long for the organization. Those people tend to not last super long. So in those cases, oftentimes it is a bit of a war of attrition, right? It's like everybody in the company kind of sees like, hey, we're a great company, and somehow this person got in and they don't seem like they're working out. Chances are they might not be here in 3 months. They might not be here in 6 months. So you got to kind of pick your battles and sometimes wait it out with people like that. But I think, the more common situation, I think, is when you have a leader who, is effective in some ways and does have some amount of influence in the organization and is a net positive in some ways, but displays behavior that is less than becoming in what you would like in your leadership. And so, I think in instances like that, the solutions are more along the lines of kind of like what Allison said. Like you gotta figure out kind of like what's going on in this person's head. How are they motivated? Like learning about motivations is really, really important. As designers, we're often motivated by creating beautiful things, by creating useful things, by solving user problems, by getting great user feedback. Like those are our kind of like internal metrics that we are, that we're trained against. And this hypothetical toxic leader may not even be a designer, right? They may be a head of product. They may be a head of engineering. They may be a CEO, God forbid. And they may be motivated by different things. Like, hey, let's say you're as a toxic head of product, right? And they're on the hook for shipping X number of things throughout the year. And unbeknownst to you, that was what they signed up for. So that's what they care about. So, sometimes getting to the bottom of behavior that seems toxic or ends up actually being toxic comes down to like figuring out how the person is motivated and then using that to determine how best to work with them. Oh, you're motivated by shipping these 10 things that you said you're on the hook with. Well, how can my team help with that?
Yeah, it's almost like using the power of design to handle these interpersonal challenges inside the workplace.
Before we move on, Aaron, I just wanted to hit on two quick related readings to Allison's article. One is Stephen Deasy, who's the head of engineering at Atlassian, shared a useful play for roles and responsibilities, which you talked about. And we'll share the link for that in the show notes. And then on the rituals front, there's a book by Kershaw Ozink and Margaret Hagan about rituals for work, which might be helpful for the folks looking for those types of things. So we'll link to that as well.
That's great. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about what happened this past week in Iowa. The caucuses happened, Democrat and Republican caucuses, but of course there was a specific design challenge related to the Democratic caucuses there. And we published a piece about this, an interview with Dana Chisnell, who's probably the foremost authority on civic design around. She's served in the White House. She's served on multiple councils for civic design and voting design. And she had some great observations about what happened there. But curious to hear your take on how things went wrong in Iowa and lessons we can learn from the design perspective on the situation.
I mean, I shook my head pretty intensely over this one. Mostly because I feel like, again, like I've been in this position as a consultant where you're asked to deliver something under untenable circumstances. And more often than not, research is the first thing that gets cut when you're under tight time constraints. Research and validation and quality assurance and all of those things. And I think about, the intention is good, right? And the timing is terrible. And oftentimes in these types of situations, which is rather unfortunate, we're not really playing out worst case scenario. And the design process in and of itself is based in kind of identifying what that worst case scenario could be if you have the time to do the research. And I was thinking recently, I heard Robert Fabricant talking about the book that he co-authored, User Friendly, and saying behavior is our medium, which I love as designers. And so if we're approaching these types of things that have such an intense impact, and we're not thinking about the behaviors of the people who are going to be using them or around any of it, and not even thinking about like basic things like maybe something's not going to work in a middle school gymnasium, then we're not thinking about, well, first of all, we're not thinking about design at scale, obviously, and we're not thinking about just the broader impact of our responsibility when we're designing products.
This one has so many interesting angles to dive into. I mean, the one I start with is, how many months did the team work on this? 2. How many months since the last caucus?
Like shocking.
48, right? There's been 48 months since the last caucus, and the team waited until not the team, but I guess the Democratic Party in Iowa waited until the last 2 months to address this, which is that's pretty much all you need to know that something was probably going to go wrong. I think the other thing that I've been thinking about with regard to this particular case is, the problem that they were trying to solve appears to be getting results in quicker, right? So they could report the winner more quickly. And, you think about that and you're like, okay, well, that doesn't sound like too bad of an objective. Like, it would be nice to know who the winner of the Iowa caucus is, like, as soon as possible. But then you think about it and you're like, you know what? What if we didn't know until the next day? Like, is that so bad? Like if the world would keep spinning, it's like, even if it slowed down, which it ended up doing, right? Like, if we found out 4, 5, 6 days later who won the caucus, like, is it that big of a deal? Probably not, right? And so I think in the name of improving this one metric, which was essentially speed to reporting, they ended up adopting this technology that was not well tested, not well designed, not well deployed. And here's where we are. And to Allison's point, the thing that gets cut first, even in expensive projects with long runways, is research and testing. And it's just a reminder that, you are not the only person that's going to be using your product. So you have to account for how it's being used in the real world. And I think we see, there was no one thing that went wrong here. There were not 9 or 10 things that went wrong. And I'm glad people like to talk about, hey, should Iowa really be first, right? Like, why does Iowa get to vote first every election? Well, you know what? I'm happy Iowa went first, right? Because now every other state can go, hey, do we have our plan together? Like, should we be using this technology that we were planning on using? And I think already Nevada has decided not to use that same app developed by the same company. So maybe it's kind of good to have a single state go, a week before everybody else.
I mean, I would also add on to that and say that hindsight's always 20/20, but I think that like the more positive spin on it potentially is that crisis equals opportunity. And I think a lot of these things tend to expose cracks in the overall system. And so it might be an issue with this one app, but I actually think there's probably a bigger systemic issue that this has begun to uncover. We all, can kind of pontificate about all the things that are broken in government and these types of systems, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that like the reality as designers, when we're thinking about these types of problems, we'll probably reference this, for years and years to come as ways we should be thinking about, like, where did things go wrong? Where were the cracks in the system? Where did we not do the right thing? Starting to your point, Mike, 48 months ago.
Yeah, I mean, and I think this came out in the article, but I believe none of this technology is used after, multiple, it's not reused. It's used once and then thrown away, right? So you would think what would happen in a situation like this is you'd have kind of like, one company that was contracted by the national, Democratic Party to build this sort of technology and then deploy it and then improve it for the next election cycle and then improve it for the next election cycle after that. Like, that's the way that you're supposed to develop software. But no, instead we have these kind of like onesies, twosies projects that get used once and then thrown away. So, that's certainly a lesson of this in my mind is we have to stop making disposable technology, because the only way to kind of make things hardened and solid is to continuously improve them.
And then, sorry, one more thing, just to like connect the line back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier in terms of teams dynamics, I can't help but think about the Fire Festival, because I wonder how many people thought that this was not a good idea and didn't say anything, and didn't feel like it was the right environment to actually say something.
Well, so we do know that did come up. Our former head of security at Twitter, who I worked with while I was there, Bob Lord, is the head of security, I believe, for the DNC, and he amongst others was sounding the alarm bells on this ahead of time, and apparently was not listened to. So there were definitely people, and I mean, I would consider that being a position of power, head of security for the DNC. Like, so there were people that high up, and probably people not quite that high up, also sounding alarm bells. And at a certain point, you have to decide: do I want to listen to people or do I not? And I think the answer is you gotta listen to people.
Yeah, and high stakes projects like this, I can't help but think that in manufacturing, there's the red button, which I think is part of Six Sigma best practices, that if something's going wrong in a manufacturing line, anyone can go over and hit the red button to stop it, so you can address it, fix it as quick as possible, and then get back on track. It seems like a red button situation would probably be good, not with all projects, but certain really high value projects like this, where there's a lot of repercussions.
So that's a really good point, and I'm really curious. I don't know if this will ever come out, but it would be really, really interesting to know, were people who were actually building this trying to push the red button, right? Like, were the people who were actually building this saying, hey, everybody, we only have a week to go. We don't think we're the ones building this. We don't think it's going to work. We should not deploy it. Like, were they doing that? Or was it the other way around? Were they saying, hey, we've tested it, everything is fine, don't worry? I hope that comes out, because to me, like, those are the fascinating kind of details of product design. And you can only really get to the ground truth by talking to the people who are actually building the thing.
Ironically, this is the subject of the final episode of Silicon Valley.
Yeah, so this was kind of on our radar to do an ethics article, and then part of a email list, which is alumni for the product design program at Stanford. And the founders of Juul were in the master's program. And so there was a long running debate around Juul and the founders. And it was really interesting to me because the discussion was very nuanced. I think, a lot of time you get the perspective that, Juul, bad, creates these products that are addictive to, young people, get people addicted to nicotine. But there were people on the list that were kind of putting up the argument that Juul had actually helped them move away from cigarettes, and that the founders, although they didn't participate in the discussion, the story is that was their original inspiration, is to help people move away from cigarettes, and that along the way, maybe the intent got a little corrupted potentially. So it was nice to see a forum where people could kind of discuss things openly with some nuance. And then this was tied to around this, recently Instagram removing likes in an effort to maybe decrease some of the social pressure around their platform. So there are a number of kind of interesting trends popping up in the design space around products. So it feels like a kind of rich time to be exploring that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, one of the most interesting things about this particular debate around ethics and design is separating intentions from outcomes. And I think oftentimes we have been content to sort of let people and companies off the hook because we think that they have good intentions. And usually they do, actually, right? Like, for all of the harm that some of these products are having in the world right now, let's just take the largest social network in the world. Like, I don't think the people who are in charge of that network started out like thinking that it was going to be this impactful and would have this effect on the world. It basically started out as a dating site. And I still give the benefit of the doubt to people running large services like that in terms of what their intentions are. But we can't end there. We have to look at the actual effects that these products are having on the world. So it's not enough to say, I am trying to build a product that helps the world, if in fact your product ends up hurting the world. It's kind of like nuclear energy in a way, right? Like, nuclear energy is not a bad thing per se, but it can be used in really, really terrible ways. And if we took the sort of hands-off view of nuclear energy that we take with some of our digital products, we wouldn't be here, right? We would be, if we allowed nuclear energy to get into the hands of every single person in the world, regardless of what their motivations are or where how good or evil they are, so to speak. If everybody in the world had the ability to build a nuclear bomb, none of us would be here. So I think that we're starting to kind of enter an awakening stage for ethics in product design, where we're not stopping at people's intentions. We're actually looking at what the unintended consequences are of what they build. And to me, I'm not versed enough on the Juul case to know kind of where that all went wrong, but clearly, even if you were to take the founders at their word that, hey, we're trying to create a product that helps people get off cigarettes, clearly that's not all that it's done. And so as a company, you need to take responsibility for the effect that your products have on the world. And as an industry, we need to keep the heat on. And like, we need to have these conversations so that people realize, like, hey, the world is watching, and it's not enough for us to build a product that we thought was going to be good for the world. We need to actually ensure that it is.
Yeah, like what's that saying? Is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But I think this is definitely not uncommon, right? We've seen this throughout the history of product design in any case. Like, even with product recalls, it's easier to be like, IKEA has a faulty dresser that's like hurting children. You can like just stop selling it, bring it back, whatever, let everybody know in the best way possible. But I think a lot of where things start to go wrong is the scaling around these things. And so from what I understand, the intention of these designers at the D School was to create something that could really solve this smoking problem. And it just, when the business started to grow and they started to get more in bed with like big business, big tobacco, and like, oh, the opportunity is so big, let's just like go for it. And there's this desire to move super, super fast that doesn't allow, again, for kind of thoughtfulness and just validation and making sure that you're doing the right thing. And it becomes very entrenched in like making money and big business and like all of those things that like you just don't see what's happening until it starts to happen. And even thinking about like the, facial recognition software and how most like large companies have said like we're not gonna release any kind of this, we're not gonna release this out into the world, but there's still companies that are building this stuff. Like I was reading about it yesterday, this Clearview AI that's been released to all in police departments across the country, and the work that they're doing, that they say that they're doing to try to capture pedophiles, et cetera. So it's like, oh my God, of course, that's amazing if you could do that. But it becomes such a fast, slippery slope where it's like, well, we just like wanted to do this one little thing, or well, and then all of a sudden it's been released at this scale that's really hard to dial back. And so I think to your point, Mike, I mean, this awakening, I think this conversation is incredibly fascinating in this time that we're in, and it's moving super fast. But I think that it's really important for us to allow the spaces again to have these conversations, to consistently be asking ourselves as designers, like, what is our responsibility? And to be allowing for like dissenting opinions in safe spaces and this like conflict and just how people think, because some people might think that having facial recognition software released to the world is perfectly fine. And some people might not. But I think like the value in having that conversation and having the debate is definitely where we're going to start to at least make strides in figuring out what the best next step could be. Because I feel like it's such a fast moving train. We have to be talking about it constantly.
The thing that really frustrates me is the it feels like a lot of designers, a lot of business people feel this sense of certainty, this clarity of we understand the customer, we understand what we're making and how it serves them. And they really don't. So what you were describing, Mike, they have great intentions. I do believe that people generally feel optimistic and positive that they're making something that is useful for the world, for people, and they can make a good business out of it. But I think let's call it what it is. That it is arrogance. That having this sense that I understand how this is going to be received in all these other situations. That is arrogance, that we have to have some humility and some mechanisms to investigate the gap between our intentions and the outcomes. And that's the part that I'm really curious about, to see how design teams develop these follow-up mechanisms, because we're so indexed on shipping very quickly and getting a thing out there and then moving to another iteration, another thing. Yes, there's some research that happens, but a lot of times research is put in to a new thing, not a thing that's out there. And now let's see, a year down the road, how's it affecting people? How's it working in ways that we didn't anticipate?
Absolutely. I think we've already gone over a couple of examples here in both of your answers. Allison started out with the IKEA example, and I think that's an example of something where everybody can agree that the outcome is bad, right? If a dresser falls over on somebody, that it's a bad outcome, right? So that it's not really something that anybody's going to debate. Then I think, one kind of level over is the facial recognition issue, where, you can be developing facial recognition. You can say, hey, I'm doing this to, help police find pedophiles. And that part of it is good. And I don't think anybody would argue that part of it is bad, but what else are you enabling, right? What other behaviors are you enabling once that data is out in the world? What other bad things can happen? And then further over from that, I think is kind of the final classification for these sorts of technologies, which is like, we don't even know what good is. So there are technologies that you can create where you show two different people the outcome, and they will look at the same outcome, and one of them will think that's a great outcome, and the other will think this is a terrible outcome. The example I'm thinking of in particular is all of the kind of political disinformation ads that we're seeing across social networks right now. So we're in the run up to the 2020 election, and there are very, very sophisticated campaigns going on right now that essentially target people on social networks based on what their interests are and who they may associate with and who they voted for last time, and all those sorts of psychographic kind of pieces of data. And these ads are very specifically fooling people into believing things that are not true. And so, if you're on one side of the aisle, you may say to yourself, well, the goal is to elect this person. And so as long as this person is elected, that's a good outcome. Like everything else will follow as long as this person is elected. If you're on the other side of the aisle, you say, that is terrible. Like we are fooling people in order to get a certain person elected. And so those, to me, that's like the final frontier is product design, where you can't even get like two people to agree what is good and what is bad.
It seems like utopia and dystopia are separated by a knife's edge, and it's this healthy debate that we need, and maybe a red button to to have some deeper conversations about how what we're making impacts the world.
Mm-hmm. One other point I want to make about product design and ethics, since we're talking about it, is there's been talk of kind of a code of ethics. Mike Montero put out the idea of having a kind of code of ethics for designers, and that was mentioned a little bit, I think, in the article. And while I don't think that's a bad idea, like in my experience, it's not usually, at least from what I've seen, it's not usually designers who are standing up in the room wanting to do something unethical. In my experience, oftentimes, in fact, it's the designer or the researcher raising their hand saying, hey, I think this is unethical, right? And so I don't think we're going to get the outcomes we want if we just have designers adhere to a code of ethics. I think you need PMs to adhere to the same code of ethics. I think you need engineers to adhere to the same code of ethics. Executives, like, product design decisions are not made in a vacuum by designers. They're made by the engineering product design team in concert with executive staff and whoever else may be involved. So I love the idea of like designers leading the way with an ethical code, but an ethical code isn't going to help you in your company if the people around you don't abide by it as well.
I'm curious what you got, if there's any products out there right now that you all feel is addressing ethical design in a really interesting or new way.
I think, well, the article mentions a couple, and I was thinking about that as well. I think that there's one fashion company, Reformation, which I like to reference often. They're kind of in the Patagonia school, but they're one of the first in high fashion to actually be thinking much more consciously and ethically about how clothing are produced and everything. And I think that they were one of the only, I'm sure that there's more at this point, but they were definitely the first that were thinking about all of the process from end to end and how the high fashion lines and clothing are produced, and from the types of materials to the people that are making them. And I think that taking the leap to do that in the fashion industry, which has never really been a leader in this type of thinking, there's now like a lot of fast followers, certainly in more fast fashion as well, to bring that conversation to the fore. Is like, how are we thinking about just the clothing that we're wearing and what it actually means, and what does it take to get it on our bodies, and what does it mean when it's not on our bodies, and how long is the life cycle for that?
Yep, I think that's a great example. Patagonia is an amazing example of that. I think there are also companies that are starting to look at pricing plans differently. A lot of companies have kind of tiered pricing plans where you pay $5 a month for this amount of usage, and $10 for this amount, and $20 for this amount. Well, there are some companies that are now proactively looking at your usage, and then after 2 or 3 months, they may actually say, "Hey, you don't actually appear like you need this level of plan. You can and probably should downgrade to this level of plan." Like that shows a level of ethics and thought that it would be antithetical to the way a lot of companies operate. Generally, we're told to kind of upsell people and get as much revenue from them as we can. But whenever I see a design touch like that, it just makes me feel good, because it makes me feel like there was a single person at that company who had the idea to do that, and they wouldn't have been able to do it by themselves, right? They needed to pitch that idea. They needed to have a good supportive team around them to agree with them that was the right idea for the product, for the brand, and for the company.
It's amazing. I think that Airbnb is an interesting case study, maybe not in always getting it right, because they've built this trust team to try to build trust between hosts and guests. And as part of that, they made some design decisions to show people's faces as part of the booking process. So a host would see the face of the person who's requesting, to stay at their place. And that had some, it was good intentions that when we see one another's face, we see a human, and it's like, okay, we're building trust here. So when they show up at your house, you feel like maybe you know them a little bit, you trust them a little bit more. But it actually enabled a lot of racial profiling that was super negative. And I think that, some companies I've seen respond to a crisis, a mistake like that, in a really inappropriate way where they subvert that, ignore it, downplay it, deploy executives to sort of like talk about how complicated it is. And, we can't really solve this very easily. And in reality, like Brian Chesky said, okay, we totally screwed up here. We can do better. We are going to do better. And then, they started to build teams to address that. They made changes in the product and they continue to make changes. Not saying it's perfect, but the way that they responded to that mistake, the gap between intention and outcome, I think is worth paying attention to.
Absolutely.
Agreed. I thought what was interesting in the article was your call out about the Humane Design Guide, which I think aligns to that, and thinking more broadly about things like sense making, group dynamics, social reasoning, rather than just like black and white reasoning. And it's super complex because a lot of things are opinions and a lot of things are, like the Airbnb example or any other example that we've talked about is like the hindsight is 2020. But I think it increasingly proves that we need to be involving many more people in the conversation because of the complexity of thought, right? Of the complexity of sense making, the complexity of group dynamics and social reasoning. Like these aren't just designers' problems to solve. These are like really broad, gnarly problems that we need to be solving. And I think it relates pretty deeply to like cognitive and behavioral neuroscience and psychology in practice with design thinking. It's just like, I feel like the opportunities of the different thought leadership that needs to be having these conversations is much broader than it's ever been.
Absolutely. It's a great place to end it. Allison, Mike, thank you so much for sitting down with us on the Design Better podcast.
Support for Design Better comes from Factor, America's #1 ready-to-eat meal delivery. Design Better listeners can save 50% on their order at factormeals.com/designbetter50. Use the code designbetter50. You know what happens at my house when things get really busy? In the evenings, we turn to takeout, which can be expensive and it's not very good for our health. Lately, we're making a better choice at crunch time. We turn to Factor for chef-created, dietitian-approved meals that are ready to eat in just 2 minutes. We like the flexibility of Factor, too. You can change your order up every week with plans from 4 to 18 meals per week, or you can pause or reschedule your deliveries at any time. The meals are so tasty. My wife and I are huge fans, and I like their smoothies, too, which I find are perfect for a quick, healthy breakfast. Factor can help you eat well and feel good while focusing on your career and your family. Head to factormeals.com/designbetter50 and use the code designbetter50 to get 50% off your order. That's code designbetter50 at factormeals.com/designbetter50 to get half off your order. Support for Design Better comes from Uplift Desk, who help you work better and live healthier. Eli and I log a lot of hours at our desks, which can be detrimental to one's health if you're not paying attention to ergonomics. Uplift Desk offer high-quality, well-designed desks, chairs, and accessories to help you build an ergonomic workspace for home or work. Eli recently got a standing desk, and I got a human-scale Freedom chair. I've been dreaming about this chair for a long time, and I finally got one. I've already noticed a big change in my posture with this chair, and my body thanks me for it. Eli is logging a lot more hours standing than sitting these days, and he can make quick transitions with the flip of a switch. We love Uplift Desk, and we know that you will too. Design Better listeners can get a special deal by visiting upliftdesk.com and use the code DesignBetter at checkout for 5% off your order. You'll get free shipping, free returns, and an industry-leading 15-year warranty. Go to upliftdesk.com, use code DesignBetter, and get 5% off. Design a better workspace with Uplift Desk. Support for Design Better comes from Gusto, who make running a small business easy. Get 3 months free at gusto.com/designbetter once you run your first payroll. Running a small business is hard work, especially all of the payroll, quarterly tax filing stuff, and HR things. I'd rather be focused on my business and my customers than dealing with the administrative duties. But Gusto makes it easy. They automate the complicated parts of running a business. With Gusto, I never miss federal or state payroll tax filings, and I love the time off requests and time tracking tools. Gusto even offers a small group health insurance option for nearly any budget. When you run into issues you need help with, their HR experts are ready to help. It's a very well-designed product, easy to use, and great emotional design that will put a smile on your face. Design Better listeners get 3 months free once they run their first payroll. Just go to gusto.com/designbetter. That's gusto.com/designbetter.
Now let's transition over to our main guest for this show, Nancy Douyon, tech ethicist. We had a chance to sit down with Nancy at a recent conference in beautiful Sydney, Australia. She has an amazing arc to her career, so without further ado, Nancy Douyon on the Design Better podcast.
Nancy, thanks for joining us on the Design Better podcast. We are here in Sydney today for Design Exchange, sitting down by the harbor, lovely setting, and fascinating background that you have. Could you tell us a little bit about your origin story? So you're born in Haiti. Tell us how you got into the world of design.
My family's from Haiti, and they came to America to seek opportunity, as many do. And it was really difficult for them because they're farmers off the coast of a beach. So to an extent, some people might think they were already living the life. But growing up in America was super hard and difficult for farmers to adjust to the culture. And then raising children in America as well was just another battle in itself. So here we are living in Haiti as a Haitian commune community. So, we don't believe in using shower water because that's wasteful. And so everyone had buckets of water that we would share, or we all had gardens in our front yards in Boston, Massachusetts. Mind you guys, this is before green was cool. So this was embarrassing to an extent, watching my parents pluck tomatoes from the front yard in lovely Boston and taking bites.
I love it. I'm an avid gardener, so
really?
I
Do you carry salt in your pocket like my dad?
I don't. I can't say that I'm that prepared.
Yeah. But, I started noticing that there was so much confusion between the cultures of how my mother understood things. So I'm pretty intelligent, but the reason I am is because my parents thought, they're middle school educated, the bigger the book, the smarter I would be, right? And so they would give me these ginormous books, and they thought the harder the cover, the more intellectual the topic. And so I'm reading these enormous amounts of books at 8 years old and learning things that a child shouldn't learn. And then I'm in school in these really, really tough situations where the schools don't really know how to handle me either. I'm referring to all the adult women as mom. And you can imagine American culture, they think I'm drugged or something's wrong. And they're telling my mother, you can't tell your daughter that she's, can call us mom. But in Haitian culture, if you're above a certain age, how people will say auntie? In our culture, we call you mom. So if I see somebody above a certain age, I automatically call you as a woman mom. And these teachers just could not understand what was wrong with me. And here I am trying to show respect, and they don't understand the context of it. So I very quickly started realizing either I was crazy, the world was crazy, my parents were crazy, America was crazy, or maybe I just needed to explore more to figure out what was the meaning behind these things. So I stopped believing necessarily in reading, and I wanted to see things in the flesh. And that's what started me traveling. I wanted to know what was true, the Haitian culture, the American culture, these books that I was reading, or when I flew out to Minnesota, was that accurate? And what I started seeing was the common denominator amongst humans. And I also started seeing the differences amongst us and the fact that we don't really appreciate those differences as much, and that there's value to that. So began my career of design without even realizing I was in design. When I was 11, I got into robotics in a very strange way. And I remember I was placed in front of a computer for the first time, like a real computer. We had computers back then, but my parents didn't really understand why I couldn't just submit my homework by typewriter. So we had garage sale typewriters, and my parents refused to understand how difficult it was that you could not backspace on a typewriter. So hopefully I'm not aging myself too much.
There's no Control Z on a typewriter.
Right, whiteout was my best friend. But, I'm in this world learning robotics, and I just get in front of this game, Solitaire. You may have seen it. And one of the questions I asked the person who was teaching me is, why is the background green? And the statement that was said to me is like, that doesn't matter. No one cares about why the background's green. We just play this. And I said, so you have no idea if you're being manipulated in any way? You have no concept? And they're like, well, these questions don't matter. And I how do you know they don't matter if you don't know the answer to them? Later on I found out, the green had to do with like the fact that the boards are green, and that's what they were trying to emulate, I guess. But I started wondering, what were the questions we weren't asking that we didn't want to know, and how could we look at those questions as an opportunity to design something that was more efficient, effective, useful for people versus folks just kind of eating all this information without knowing where it's coming from. And the opposite is true too, whereas designers and engineers feeding people information without fully understanding how they're utilizing that around the world. And that was something I also want to say I noticed. I would go to Haiti, and I remember I thought Haitians invented voice over IP. I was like positive of it because they knew how to hack into systems before we did to call us in America. I remember the first time I got a call, I'm like, we have one phone in the community. How did you call me? And they're like, oh, we figured some things out. There's this internet. We went to the internet cafe and we did this and that. And I'm like, oh my God, this is brilliant. If only the rest of the world knew. Of course, eventually, the rest of the world found out. But I really started also appreciating innovation from people who were different and how they were able to take things that were less valuable, or as underrepresented people, they had less tools to make things work for them. And as a result, they were able to build these efficient systems that were much more scalable than we would here in the States, where we have all the resources possible.
Constraints can create opportunity, which is a really fundamental principle of design. You hear people talk about the white page or the blank page fear of, I could put anything on this page and it creates paralysis. You're not quite sure what to do. It's fascinating to hear this, coming from Haiti, and there are certain constraints from growing up in Haiti, and then also as a kid having certain constraints. How do you think that influenced the way that you solve problems today?
Well, I think what's great about it is it opened up my mind to no limitations for trying to solve problems. I think I understood very early that design was problem solving. And you may have heard this, of course, before. And I have a lot of folks who think it's art, and people talk about that sometimes. But it was super interesting to me that I could look at a stovetop and figure out a better way to design it. Like, why are the buttons on the front of the stove all in one row when they could be placed in the exact design of the stove? You know what I'm talking about? Like where you don't know if you have to turn on the top left or the whatever. And then I started hearing really interesting stories. Like, we'll stick with the stove example of like Germans going to Panama and giving families stoves and coming back a few years later to find out how they were using it and finding out that people were using them to hold dishes. Just the same thing I do with dishwashers. I've never really used a dishwasher. I just use it to hold my dishes. And when they tried to understand deeper why they weren't using these stovetops, it was because they took away something that was already prevalent with the stoves that they had. They had these round stoves that were centered in the room. They created community. They brought people together. There was so much other meaning and value that was taken away with it when the design became, to an extent, less efficient. And so I wanted to start understanding how we could use design to help design at scale. Because as a Haitian woman, a Black woman, I could not see myself in any of the designs I was working on. I've worked at Google and Intel and Cisco, IBM, and I couldn't see myself in the products that I was working on. And it's really interesting when you're a researcher or an engineer and you're building these products for other people and you have a voice at the table as well, and others do, but how do you tell people that, hey, I think you're only designing for westernized societies? Or
do you have specific examples of that?
So, for example, Uber had decided, you guys know about Uber, that they wanted to introduce their product to the world, but some considerations they didn't think about was the fact that credit cards, which is the primary function used in Uber, that 3-digit PIN on the back isn't actually available on credit cards around the world. In fact, people don't really use credit cards all over the world like that. And so in South America, they don't have the PIN. There's other ways to pay for things. And so what ended up happening is the product in America, where it's like, oh, wait, we have an opportunity that all of us can use it, it became a luxury around the world, because only if you had a credit card would you be able to get on this product. But when the decision was made to introduce cash to the platform, which it is introduced on the platform in places like India, we started seeing it create opportunity for people who didn't have access to transportation in ways that were previously used. We were starting to get a different kind of customer, and that was increasing our profit. It was increasing accessibility. It was increasing versatility with our product, and it became something that made the product a lot more global, if that makes sense. And so I see a lot of these examples when we kind of take ourselves, our own Western perspectives out and say, some people thought that cash would be dangerous if we introduced it in the world. But the question that you ask is, well, have they been using it now? Is it a danger today? Another good example is, if you buy, and I'll tell a story. I was in India and I was asking permission if I could wear a sari, and because I thought they were so beautiful. And a friend of mine said, "Oh, it's absolutely fine." I went to the store and have a language difference with the gentleman in the store. He's showing me these materials that I think could be better looking. So I repeat Beyonce over and over again, hoping he'll understand that means I need something prettier. He didn't know who Beyonce was, but he got the gist. So we
there's a place in the world where people don't know who Beyonce is.
Can you believe it?
I can't believe
I
that.
cannot believe that. And so here in 2 days, I got this beautiful sari made, and I'm in the streets shopping in sort of like a farmer's market. I mean, outside buying fruit, and everyone is staring at me because I know I look absolutely gorgeous, right? And a friend runs up to me and says, "Oh my God, what are you doing?" And I said, "Clearly, I'm attractively buying fruit." And she says, "You're wearing a wedding dress." I had no idea that the color red and gold in India represented celebratory weddings and things like that. And so people just thought I was a bride that got hungry and ran away or something. But the thing is, here I am in school, studying human factors engineering, and they're saying red keeps you alert. And that's why we have our casinos with red colors. And we pump oxygen into the spaces so that people can stay there longer. We place no clocks on the walls. The most addictive machines are here and there. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if red impacts people in the States one way, are you sure it impacts people around the world the same way? If white is a color for funerals in India and red is a color for wedding? And so I was super curious about these questions. So I actually started in engineering, ended up moving quickly into research to try to get these questions answered, which makes sense. I was this curious kid. I always wanted questions answered, so I found the perfect world for me.
There's a quote we found, and I'll just paraphrase it, but it said that you went to the Google search engine, you typed in all your passions, sociology, psychology, computer science, engineering, love, forgiveness, and that 2 fields popped up, human factors engineering, which you just mentioned, and human-computer interaction. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that part of the story, what led you in that.
So I noticed you stated at the end the love and forgiveness aspect that I put in there. Well, when I was in undergrad, I had a lot of roles. I worked at Harvard, working in what is now called cybersecurity. I worked at MIT, working in urban planning. I worked in the city of Boston, working on policy and things like that. And while still in the world of tech, I just felt like there was something missing in my work, and it was this idea of healing in design. And it's something that's really important to me because I feel like, my parents eventually had to go back to America. I ended up in foster care in America. And it was a really tough world for me to live officially in a system. And I was in 8 different homes. It was the worst experience of my life. And this is from the ages of 12 all the way through college. And it was so important to me. I mean, to heal myself while working through this process. And I eventually did. I found a lot of different interesting ways of forgiving people who had caused harm in my life. And I didn't know if there was a world to mix that with this interest in engineering. So I'm not really sure why that popped off. I'm pretty sure it crossed off the word forgiveness and love, but I realized there was an opportunity for me to introduce this idea of belonging and love into the world of design.
I think that's really interesting and feels very timely. It feels like a common thread we see with a lot of headlines around technology right now is that we're shifting from this idealistic view of what technology could do for our world to create this utopia and finding out that the utopia is it's not here like we wanted. And your perspective is really interesting because you look at design in a very inclusive way, in a very in the truest sense of the word, that the worldview, so many different people have different problems and they approach products, design, world situations differently. And you've kind of found yourself in what I would call an advocacy role, that almost like bringing people's attention to this huge gap. You're missing this huge piece of the population. You're solving a problem for yourself and you're not seeing the problem from other people's perspective. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that? How does that manifest in your work today? How's that
Sure.
meaningful to you?
A couple years ago, I introduced at the UX Enterprise Conference a term I call nobility complex. It's this idea that we don't recognize the privilege that we have,
Yeah.
and that as a result of not understanding our privilege in design and as well our explicit bias, we're actually designing to pat ourselves on the back and not necessarily designing to make others feel included in things. The way I even came up with this concept is I noticed when I was in Haiti a day before the Haitian earthquake, my parents went missing. My mother was missing for 6 days. My father was missing for 2 weeks, and I'd lost my mind. And everybody knew what was going on in Haiti. Everyone knew I had been in Haiti. Everybody wanted to help. And so I'm getting so many calls from people saying, hey, let me send clothes out there. I want to help in some way. Don't worry. I'm going to take care of this in some way. We'll figure out some way to bring good in Haiti. And I just kept hearing over and over again people saying, where can I send my clothes? Where can I send clothes to bring to Haiti? And one day I snapped and I said, guys, there are no homes. There's floods. Where are we going to put these clothes that you're sending? And I realized in that moment that people didn't take the time to ask me what I need. No, people didn't take the time to co-design with me to figure out what I needed solutions for. What I actually needed help with when I spoke to this particular friend is we needed to build wells in Haiti, right? Because we had, cholera and unclean water, and we need to find a way to get that in. And that was, I think University of Michigan at the time that I was at working on my PhD, a few of my friends got together and raised, I want to say, a little over $2,000, and we built multiple wells across Haiti. But it was that snapping moment that made me realize that we spend a lot of time, just in general, in our societies, not turning our assumptions into questions. We're so quick to help, but it's not coming from a bad place.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure people understand that I'm not trying to beat up on the fact that we have this privilege in the world. I know the word privilege is a really scary word right now, but even I have privilege, right? In the position I am, working at these companies that have the opportunity to scale. So it's important with my privilege that I speak up. And it's important that if somebody is saying things to you that you feel is more sumptuous, that we try to get them to really take a look at what question they're not answering. So it kind of comes back to this idea of how can we make sure that we're building more inclusively? And this means even as a white male, you can be part of designing more inclusively by thinking a little bit more openly about your privilege in these differences in society and having these uncomfortable, hard conversations.
So your story about Haiti and the clothes reminded me, we helped out with a class where we interviewed a bunch of the survivors of the Paradise Fires. And big organizations like the Red Cross were sending people things like shovels, and their house was obviously just completely gone. Well, how does a shovel help me in this situation? And no matter that the intent was really good, but there was just this big disconnect between what the people needed and what was sent to them. So I'm curious if you have any other areas of focus where you see that mismatch right now in tech in your own work, or places where you could see this, design being applied that way.
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is I think every company I've ever worked with has had that mismatch in some way or another. Part of it is because, when you think about it, who are we hiring? I've always been, for the most part, the only Black woman in a group. And so it wasn't surprising to me when Google launched their first watch, you guys remember those digital things, that none of them could fit on the wrist of women, or the fact that they were all Black, which is, sometimes a color that's associated when you think about men. In fact, if you interview men and women about the color preferences they have, males will tend to pick between a few colors, like 3 colors, and women will choose between a lot more colors. And so you can even see in the design world, I find a design in tech is very masculine without consideration of like, hey, throw a little rose gold on there and you've just increased opportunity for others. Think about what we're teaching people with design. How often do you see baby changing stations in men's rooms?
Very rarely.
Very rarely. And so what are you
problem.
saying? Men aren't alone with their children, right? And but here's the opportunity here. Now you have this conversation about all gender bathrooms and transgender bathrooms, and that's creating more versatility and accessibility for men, right? And saying that, you have more opportunity to change the narrative of what you can do as well. That's what I mean with the colors and things like that. I think we do limit ourselves sometimes with our stereotypes that we're completely unaware of. And I'll give you an example where this went well when we were designing what we thought was for just an underrepresented community, and how it actually created opportunity for everyone, apart from just this like all gender bathroom. So I'll use Uber again as an example. At Uber, they decided to create a technology for drivers who are hard of hearing so that they could be added onto the platform. So now deaf drivers can pick up passengers and the screen flashes for you to pick up someone. And what was interesting about bringing that to the platform is originally it was thought that that would, be a great thing for just folks who are hard of hearing, but some of you may have experienced drivers who may have had a sign you see that it says the driver might be deaf, but they seem to be speaking just fine. We noticed that people were using the feature who were immigrants to help them with the barrier of language so that they would not be, scored unjustly or things like that. We even noticed people turning on the feature who just didn't want to talk to anybody. So there you go, opportunity for everyone, But things like, I don't know if you know, autocomplete was first created as an accessibility project, and now it's something that we all have the pleasure of using. Google Voice was created first as an accessibility project, and now it's something that we all have the opportunity of enjoying. So in thinking about the underrepresented people in our technology, you're also increasing opportunity for yourself.
Sure. I want to talk a little bit. You mentioned hiring. Hiring is hard, very difficult to do. You said something, I truly believe this. If you want to hire somebody, look at their story. Why do you look at a person's story when you're hiring? What does that tell you?
This is a bit personal for me because, I spent my entire life trying to chase what I believe would get white people to hire me, right? So I went to the MITs, the University of Michigan, the Harvards. I only would try to work for these top organizations. And it makes me really sad to think that people think the only opportunity is to just kind of chase validation to these larger corporations. When growing up, I was very fortunate. I said I started off in robotics, but very fortunate that at 12, I was taken under wing by a professor at MIT, Mitchell Resnick, who from the Media Lab designed a program called Computer Clubhouse. And there were children there, from 8 to 18 who are much more talented than me, way more talented, who should be probably in better positions than me. But unfortunately, because of their circumstances, they didn't get to where I am. I had to work 4 jobs my first year of college to pay off school. Some people just don't have that ability or capacity to do that. I was alone. My parents weren't here. So my entire focus was on myself, but some folks have to take care of their entire families. Some folks have children along the way in their journey and have to catch up. So how do you know that somebody, if given the chance, would be the right fit to learn and do great things in this role? Because I know tons of people who'd be great fits, but they don't fit the typical archetype of what we're looking for in tech. That's why I say focus on kind of the story, because I feel like in the story, you'll get to hear more deeply what their differences can help you with.
Yeah.
I think that the example of me seeing design very early as a way to really share stories to help people see things differently. I became a storyteller as an engineer. And I think that's an important tool to have. So why not hire storytellers? Or when I was helping Uber hire teams, I built with the team a program called a Global Scalable Research Platform. And we were hiring people in India and Brazil and Mexico, but we couldn't find UX, right, in these places per se. So we started interviewing journalists. We interviewed TV producers, people who knew how to share the perspective of empathizing with someone else, and thought that that would be a better fit to introduce them and train them in UX versus just trying to find somebody maybe in America and sending them to India to bring their American perspective to UX in India.
This is fascinating, looking for like adjacencies, skills. Can you share with us a story, maybe without names, but someone that you've interviewed where you saw the soft skills or the foundation upon which the company could build through their background, their origin story?
Sure. And actually, this girl, I'll give an example, was pretty successful. I spoke at Adobe Max, and a young woman overheard me speaking, and my colleagues came over to me and said, "Did you hire a Black Trini girl to just cheer for you on Twitter?" And I said, "Nope, Black people don't know all Black people," surprisingly, And so I ended up somehow connecting with this young woman on Twitter, and she was telling me, her background was in music. And she said she really wanted to get into design, and she had been following me for some time, but had no idea how to get into the world of design. And I was asking her about her skill sets, and while she was telling me her skills, I thought she was already a designer. I really was sure of it because a lot of her skills were of empathy, of wanting to hear other people's perspective, of taking herself out of the way, just really made sense to me. She just didn't have the language. Even like something like doing a contextual inquiry, she knew she's done those before, but she just didn't have the language for it. So I created a document called on Medium, it's called the UX cheat sheets. Cheat sheets, I have 3 of them. And the idea is that you can read these documents and see where you fall in as far as, are you more of a coder? Are you more of an artist? And what do I need to learn? What words do I need to learn to show that I have this skill set? So what I asked her to do was take a look at this list I came up with and try to self-teach yourself some of these skills and try to apply them to work that you've already have done, or create new projects so that you can at least have a portfolio. So here's the gap, right? She has no portfolio. She needs a portfolio to get into the field. She doesn't have the right language. She doesn't really know the methodologies, but she, I believe, has had those skills. She just doesn't know the language. So what she did is go back, build out a portfolio. I said, 3 to 5 things, and just see if these words plug in somewhere. And within a matter of like a few weeks, she comes up with this magnificent portfolio. And I was blown to pieces. I sent it to everyone. And now she is doing amazingly. She is a UX designer. She's working for Deloitte right now. And before that, worked with a few other companies. But she came from the music world. And just because she had enough of the skills already, she just needed that language. She was able to position herself in this world of designing for empathy. And it's amazing that she's at a corporation that was able to see that despite her educational background.
It's a great story. Tied to what you were just talking about, we dug up another quote from you that said you had this great technical ability, but you're too scared to pursue a computer science degree, and you believed it was a man's job despite the fact that you were already doing it. Could you tell us a little bit about maybe what unlocked would help you change your perspective about that and become successful in your field?
When I started learning computer science, I was 12 years old. And these are from my advisors and mentors at MIT. And many of them were women. And I now know that, back in like the 70s and 80s, women were like basically 50% of computer science field. It was kind of considered secretarial work. So they were pigeoned into that world. And then somebody changed the narrative and it became a man's world, which was interesting. And so when I got to school, I didn't feel like it was a world that I could be in because there seemed, again, to be this archetype to it. So I decided instead of going to school for computer science, I went to school for information systems, even though I was teaching computer science at the time. Luckily, I got to do sociology and all these other interesting things. So I ended up getting a degree in sociology. I got a degree in information systems. And I remember I finally started taking a computer science class, and I thought I was cheating. I really thought, because, they make you go through the tutorial, and I didn't need a tutorial to do the assignment. And so I completed the assignment and thought I had done something wrong because I had figured out how to do it without using this kind of book. But I think what ended up happening as I kept growing into it is that I figured that you don't necessarily have to learn in the same way others do, and that you can be self-taught. And I'm very, very big on that. I feel like a lot of what I've learned was because of, not in school, but really what I've learned from actual practice, which I got to do really, really early on. And so when I started seeing that I had almost like a differentiator, a creative way to see it, and I've always stood out in the room. Somebody once told me when I was trying to be a tech bro, which I'm not very good at, that they couldn't understand why I was trying to fit in because they felt like tech bros were so strange that if I was just myself, I'd fit in just perfectly fine, just be strange. And I think that's what clicked for me, was like, you know what? I already have the ability. Why does the look have to match? If anything, I might be inspiring to be a different look in this field. And so I grabbed it by both hands and I went forward with it and decided that I was going to ignore the image and be this kind of creative bubble burst of color that had, a different approach. I call it the Latina approach, the Latinx approach, because, Haitians are Latina. And I said, that's the fire. So what you guys are experiencing with me is a little fire. That's a little different, but it's all it does is make things better, by adding a little bit of color to what we already have.
So thinking about, there are a lot of different types of folks who listen to this podcast, and they're probably pretty inspired by the global perspective that you have. You've traveled to, I think you said 70 different countries, which is impressive. Not too many people have visited that many countries. Do you have advice for people, for designers, for people who are making products and software for other human beings, how they can bring more of a global perspective to their work?
I truly believe I'm a fan of immersion in other cultures. Please travel, people. And I mean, yes, travel globally. I mean, I was living in Nepal for a little bit, and my rent was $1.78 a day, and my meals were 13 cents all you could eat. I was never coming back, But it was so amazing to learn a different perspective from my own. I also lived in Spain. When I lived in Spain, I was yelled at I was living with a family. I wanted to live with a family because I wanted to understand their experience. And they said, "You Americans," which was exciting to me. Europe, they would see me as American versus like a black girl or something. She's like, "You guys play with your food too much." She was talking about the fact that we have rabbits as pets, and she thought that was disgusting. That rabbit should be eaten, right? She told me my name should be Maria because of I guess the Franco days. The name Maria was a proper name for women. And she's just spewing out everything I'm doing wrong in this world. And I'm smiling because she has no idea she's been fed this cultural perspective, and that if only she stepped outside her box, she'd learn something different. Right? But I was impressed. I was constantly in trouble. She threw my food out of the microwave because she says, "A woman, you should cook." And I'm like, it's cooked. You're just putting it in the microwave. And she's like, "You cook from scratch." And I've never had a microwave since. I've never owned a microwave since. And I make everything from scratch. And it's just so interesting just kind of learning from other perspectives. But let's say you just can't leave your country per se. I say, look within your organizations for people who are a little different than yourself. There are ERGs that you can leverage for study purposes or to ask interesting questions to if you have some, You can visit other neighborhoods. Do your research outside of the Bay Area. The Bay has changed quite a bit. And so that could be as little as going to Oakland or as, going to Sacramento to do your studies just to get a perspective that is different. I remember I was doing studies in Mountain View, and I kid you not, we had 2 medical doctors in a study of 8 people. And I'm like, I just don't know if this is like an example of the real world. I think we must be able to find someone who could, one, use this money that we're giving. Mm-hmm. I don't know where this doctor came from that we pay for our studies, but it would be really good to just kind of get a perspective that we didn't have before. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to get out of our own bubble and our own box by just experience, even especially across the United States. I've driven across the United States a few times, and it's fascinating to me, just the differences in culture in this country alone.
Yeah, it's a big place.
Definitely.
Nancy, right now, what's inspiring you? And that could be a book, it could be a person. It doesn't have to be about design necessarily. Just what are you finding inspiring at the moment?
So right now, what I'm inspired by is trying to create better metrics to measure love and belonging in the work that we do. I think that we have been so focused on trying to build products that have more attention and build products that have more focus. And while it might seem usable to you, it may not actually be making the world a better place. So I want to try to figure out how to talk a little bit more about consciously designing. And I'm hoping with the book that I'm writing, I can share some of these experiences that I've had all over the world, these interesting stories of my life and others to really help hopefully inspire people to see kind of like I've seen these just differences in human beings and the beauty in them and the fact that we each have a role in trying to make this world a better place. And so as I look at the fact that I've been fortunate to work in something I call personally the 3 S's for myself. The things that make me passionate are scale, systematic change, and social impact. And I'm in this privileged world where I get to work with these large corporations that get to impact the world both positively or negatively. And if I can continue to help guide people into helping this world become a little more belonging each day, then I feel like I've done my service to this world.
Nancy Douyon, thank you so much for joining us on the Design Better podcast.
Thank you.